In just 48 hours, one man from the Sahel turned a quiet diplomatic stage into a storm that circled the globe. The hall in Kingston, Jamaica, was meant for polite speeches and predictable applause. Yet when President Ibrahim Traoré rose to speak, he tore through the silence like a blade through silk. There was no script. No teleprompter, only to throw, unfiltered and impossible to contain. What began as a conference on cooperation became a courtroom of conscience. The Jamaican Prime Minister demanded an apology within 48 hours. But Traoré did not bend. His words crossed oceans. Truth does not bow to deadlines. In that instant, the world witnessed more than defiance. It saw a leader willing to risk isolation for integrity. Stay with us. This is not a scandal. It is a turning point the world will remember. Subscribe and witness how one African voice dared to stand when others stayed silent. The air in Kingston that morning was heavy with protocol. Flags of dozens of nations lined the hall, each representing a promise of diplomacy, each concealing a measure of hypocrisy. Journalists whispered predictions, another meeting of rehearsed sentences, another day of empty declarations. No one expected the tremor that was about to strike. President Ibrahim Traoré entered without fanfare. He wore no lavish suit, no glittering medals, just the khaki uniform that had become his symbol, plain, austere, and unmistakably honest. When he stepped to the podium, the hum of conversation fell to silence. His eyes swept the room not as a guest seeking approval, but as a witness bearing testimony. He began softly, speaking of cooperation and shared destiny. But then his tone sharpened, cutting through the air. He spoke of corruption not as an African curse, but as a human disease that eats away at nations pretending to be civilized. He spoke of the hypocrisy of aid, of systems built to keep the powerful comfortable and the poor dependent. And then came the sentence that froze the hall. Truth does not expire with the deadline. The translator hesitated. The audience leaned in. Some ministers shifted uncomfortably. Others lowered their eyes. The message was clear. He was not there to flatter, but to reveal. Within minutes, murmurs filled the back rows. Cameras zoomed in on the faces of diplomats whose smiles had vanished. Traoré spoke with the conviction of a soldier who had seen too much silence and decided to speak instead. He compared lies to chains, invisible yet heavy, and said that dignity begins where fear ends. Each phrase landed like a verdict. When he finished, there was no applause, only the sound of tension. The Jamaican Prime Minister, Andrew Holness, left the stage with a forced smile. Hours later, he summoned his cabinet. The statement was sharp. Ibrahim Traoré had 48 hours to apologize or face diplomatic consequences. The world's media rushed to capture the standoff, an African president accused of arrogance for daring to tell the truth. But what they didn't see, at least not yet, was how quickly those 48 hours would transform from a countdown into a revolution of conscience. In the streets of Kingston, local radio stations replayed the clip on loop. Some called it an insult, others called it a revelation. The hashtags #truth needs no apology and #TRAORE for 8 hours began to spread. Students in universities debated his words. Taxi drivers argued in traffic jams. Market vendors repeated his lines like proverbs. For the first time in years, Jamaica's public squares were not filled with complaints but with questions. People began asking why truth sounded foreign and why courage seemed imported. By nightfall, reporters from London, Paris, and Washington were already dissecting his tone, calling it reckless, populist, and unfit for diplomacy. Yet the more they condemned, the more attention the speech gained. Clips of Traoré's statement crossed platforms, translated into multiple languages. In less than a day, what had started as a single voice from the Sahel had become a moral tremor echoing across oceans. The 48-hour ultimatum, meant to humiliate, had instead amplified the message. The countdown was no longer ticking toward silence, it was ticking toward awakening. And as the second dawn broke over Kingston, something irreversible was already in motion. But instead of silence, the world heard an echo. The countdown began the moment the cameras stopped rolling. 48 hours, that was the window the Jamaican government gave to mend what they called an insult to national dignity. But what followed was not submission. It was ignition. Within hours, radio hosts in Kingston replayed the entire speech on loop. One station described it as a slap in the face of our pride. Another called it the medicine we refused to take. On social media, something unprecedented began to unfold. A short video clip, just 15 seconds, of Ibrahim Traoré saying truth does not bow to deadlines was shared across the Caribbean. By sunset, it had crossed the Atlantic. The first wave hit the streets. In downtown Kingston, students poured out of campuses holding signs made of cardboard and conviction. Truth needs no apology, they wrote in black paint. Vendors closed their stalls. Musicians joined with drums. Mothers brought their children. It wasn't a protest, it was an awakening. Loud yet peaceful. Angry yet graceful. The police stood by, unsure whether they were witnessing dissent or renewal. What they saw were faces ordinary citizens claiming moral ownership of their country's voice. At night, the city pulsed with conversations. On talk shows, callers debated whether Traoré's words had exposed the hypocrisy of their own leaders. In cafes, people asked if Jamaica had become too fragile to hear the truth. The second wave came from across the ocean, in London, Toronto, and New York. Members of the Jamaican diaspora began holding They lit candles under signs that read, "Truth has no deadline." For years, they had lived between two worlds, home and exile, pride and disappointment. Now, they found their identity reflected in a man from the Sahel who dared to speak what they had long whispered. By the 24th hour, newsrooms from CNN to the BBC had caught the scent of controversy. Pundits debated whether the Burkina Faso president was out of line or simply ahead of his time. Editorials framed him as a disruptor, a voice from the global south, unafraid to stare the post-colonial order in the eye. Meanwhile, Andrew Holness's cabinet was cracking under pressure. Leaked emails showed ministers divided, some demanding a firm response, others admitting quietly that Traoré had only said what everyone knows. The ultimatum, once a show of authority, began to look like fear. By the 36th hour, Jamaica was no longer waiting for an apology. It was waiting for meaning. Churches discussed the sermon-like quality of Traoré's words. Professors quoted him in lectures about ethics and governance. A local newspaper headline read, "Was it an insult or a mirror?" When the final hours of the deadline arrived, the streets filled once more. Tens of thousands gathered in front of government buildings, not to riot, but to witness. Some brought flowers, some held flags. Many just stood in silence, listening to the ticking of a clock projected on a giant screen, a countdown that no longer belonged to the government, but to the people. At precisely the 40th hour, the President of Jamaica addressed the nation again. He repeated his demand. "We expect a formal apology." But at that same moment, thousands of miles away in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré stepped before a camera and delivered a single line that froze the world. "The truth does not negotiate with time." It was calm, precise, and devastating. Within minutes, television stations cut between the two leaders. Two screens, two worlds, one defending pride, the other defending principle. The 48th hour struck. No apology came. And in that silence, Jamaica woke up. Students abandoned their buses and joined marches. Priests spoke of moral renewal. Across social networks, a phrase began trending like a heartbeat. He said what we could not. The countdown ended, but the movement had just begun. And as the clock ticked toward the deadline, something greater than politics was waking up. The 48 hours had passed. The ultimatum was over, but the story had only just begun. What Jamaica expected to end with silence erupted instead into dialogue. Across the island, it was as if an invisible curtain had been torn open, revealing what everyone already knew, yet feared to say. In the capital, teachers arrived at school early, printing Traoré's words on chalkboards. Truth is not an insult, it is a mirror. Students were asked to write essays on honesty and leadership. Some compared the Burkina Faso president to their own heroes, Marcus Garvey, Nelson Mandela, Malcolm X. Others simply called him the man who spoke without fear. At the local markets, conversations turned into debates. A woman selling fruit asked a policeman, "How long can a country survive pretending not to hear the truth?" He didn't answer. Just smiled. Radio hosts invited pastors, journalists, and activists to discuss whether dignity could exist without accountability. Churches overflowed. For the first time in years, people weren't praying for miracles, were praying for courage. By the third day, the momentum had grown unstoppable. Thousands gathered peacefully outside government offices with banners that read "Truth needs no apology." Mothers walked hand in hand with their children. Retired soldiers stood beside students. Street musicians played drums that echoed through the hills. It wasn't chaos, it was conscience. In Montego Bay, a fisherman told a reporter, "We don't protest against our government. We protest for our soul." His words spread faster than any official statement. Across Jamaica, civic groups began publishing open letters, calling for transparency in public spending. Long-forgotten anti-corruption reports resurfaced, printed again by local newspapers. People who had once been ignored were now being heard. What was once a political controversy had turned into a social awakening. The ultimatum meant to defend national pride had birthed something deeper: national self. Commentators began referring to it as the 48-hour revolution. Inside Parliament, unease grew. Some lawmakers whispered that the crisis had gone too far. Others quietly admitted it might be the beginning of something necessary. A young member of Parliament, speaking off record, said, "Maybe Traoré didn't insult us. Maybe he reminded us." Across the ocean, in Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré remained calm. He gave no speeches, no interviews, no statements. He simply returned to his work, visiting soldiers, meeting farmers, and rebuilding infrastructure. His silence became more powerful than any press release. For millions watching online, he embodied a different kind of leadership, one grounded not in words, but in steadiness. Commentators called it diplomacy by character. They said that what had begun as a clash of pride had transformed into a contest of integrity. In Jamaica, people realized the real issue was never a foreign president. Towards it was the mirror he had held up. Soon, small community groups began to form. Students organized public reading circles, discussing governance and ethics. Retired judges volunteered to explain laws on transparency. Local journalists launched online newsletters to track public projects. Ordinary citizens were learning what governments often forget. Accountability is not an insult. It is a right. By the end of the week, posters of Traoré's quote appeared on university walls and shop windows. Dignity begins where fear ends. They weren't signs of foreign influence. They were reminders of shared humanity. The story had left politics and entered the heart of society. For the first time in years, Jamaica was talking not about scandals or elections, but about integrity in homes, churches, markets, and classrooms. One question echoed louder than any government order. If one man can speak truth without fear, why can't we? The government's ultimatum had expired, but the people's courage had just begun. While Jamaica wrestled with its conscience, the world was watching. What began as a small island's diplomatic storm had rippled across continents, carried by satellites, journalists, and whispers in the halls of power. Every newsroom from Washington to Paris, from Lagos to Nairobi, was now asking the same question. Had the age of polite diplomacy finally met its reckoning? The footage of Ibrahim Traoré's speech spread like wildfire. In some studios, anchors called it reckless. In others, courageous. Analysts argued that it marked the birth of a Southern voice no longer willing to whisper. Western commentators accused him of moral arrogance. But millions of ordinary people across Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean heard something else. They heard permission to speak truth again. In Africa, the impact was immediate. Youth movements from Accra to Dakar began quoting Traoré's line, "The truth does not negotiate with time." Newspapers described him as the soldier who fought with words. In Ouagadougou, citizens gathered in public squares to show solidarity with Jamaica, proving that moral unity could exist without formal treaties. Even European editors, though reluctant, admitted that the reaction was extraordinary. A journalist from Le Monde wrote, "It is rare for an African president to awaken the moral debate in the Caribbean. Rarer still that the echo feels justified." This was not just about Jamaica. It was about a changing world, one where dignity spoke louder than protocol. The political elite debated sovereignty. The public debated sincerity. The question was no longer about who was right, but about who was honest. And for the first time, Burkina Faso appeared on global headlines, not as a landlocked country of struggle, but as a nation that dared to define ethics in international dialogue. The message was simple yet seismic. A small country can move the conscience of giants. The old order had relied on silence, on fear disguised as respect. But Traoré's calm defiance had broken that rhythm. It reminded the world that the moral compass of humanity might no longer point north in classrooms, churches, cafes, and parliaments. One idea began to take root. Truth may divide governments, but it unites people. And across oceans, a quiet question echoed: who truly governs the truth? The storm that began with a speech had now become a mirror reflecting the soul of a nation. Jamaica stood between two paths, one of pride, the other of transformation. The government wanted the issue buried. The people wanted the truth to live. And somewhere between those two forces, history was quietly choosing sides. Inside Parliament, Prime Minister Andrew Holness faced a fractured cabinet. Some urged him to hold firm, to defend national honor. Others whispered that the moral tide was turning, that a nation could not silence its conscience forever. Reports surfaced of ministers resigning behind closed doors. The once confident government now moved like a boxer dazed by its own punch. In the streets, the tone had changed. The anger of the first days had cooled into determination. People were no longer shouting, they were organizing. Civil groups began drafting petitions for government transparency. Journalists created online platforms to track public spending. University students held weekly forums to debate ethics and leadership. It was not a revolution of fire, it was a revolution of accountability. International observers called it the 48-hour awakening. The irony was impossible to ignore. A foreign leader had been accused of offending Jamaica's pride, yet his words had restored its dignity. It was as if the island had rediscovered the lost art of moral conversation. Abroad, Traoré remained silent, his focus on rebuilding and reforming back home. But in silence, his influence grew. Commentators described him as the quiet storm, a leader who spoke less but meant more. His refusal to apologize became an emblem of conviction in an age of convenient diplomacy. In the following weeks, Jamaica faced a choice: to rebuild its narrative around outrage or around courage. 3 possible futures stood before them. In the first, the outrage fades. Commissions are formed, statements issued, and the country resumes its old rhythm, wiser perhaps, but unchanged. In the second, dialogue prevails. Parliament opens new laws for fiscal transparency. Youth representatives are invited to local councils. Journalists regained freedom to question without fear. This path is slower, but real, a nation reborn, not by punishment, but by principle. And in the third, fear wins. The government clamps down on dissent, branding truth as foreign interference. The streets grow quiet again, not with peace, but with exhaustion. Between these 3 roads lies the destiny of every nation that hears the truth and must decide whether to silence it or let it grow. The clock that once counted down to an ultimatum now measures something deeper: how long a society can resist transformation. Once it has heard its own heartbeat. The clock had stopped, but the echo of dignity was still ticking. When the lights dimmed in Kingston and the cameras were packed away, something remained, something no decree could erase. It was not the speech itself, nor the outrage it caused. It was the quiet understanding that truth, once spoken, cannot be recalled. In the months that followed, Jamaica changed in ways too subtle for headlines, but too deep to deny. Citizens began demanding public ledgers, teachers encouraged open debates, and churches filled with sermons about courage over comfort. The shock of 48 hours had given birth to a slow, steady pulse of reform, and thousands of miles away, in the heart of the Sahel, Ibrahim Traoré continued his work, planting trees, rebuilding villages, and speaking softly of integrity as if it were a seed that must be watered, not shouted. To some, he remained controversial. To others, he had become a compass, a reminder that leadership begins not with applause, but with conviction. For the first time, the world looked at Burkina Faso and did not see a small, poor nation in the desert. It saw a frontier of moral clarity, a place where one man's refusal to apologize had awakened the conscience of another continent. The journalist who covered the story in Kingston wrote months later, "It was never about an insult, it was about a mirror." And perhaps that is the legacy that endures, the mirror held up by a foreign voice, reflecting the courage hidden within us all. Truth does not need permission. It does not need apology. It only needs to be heard. If you believe that courage still matters more than comfort, share this story. Subscribe for more voices from Africa that dare to speak truth without apology.